And the first book we're going to look at deals with probably one of the biggest problems we have as people who are Christians. And this is one of the biggest reasons why people who aren't Christians, because they're like, why do bad things happen? Right? I'm a good person. Why do bad things happen? I'm not Hitler. Why did that happen to me? Right? That's kind of like our bar. Like, that's like, as long as you're not that, like, you're probably a good person, right? Like, if we're honest, like, we all make deals with ourselves and say, well, as long as I don't do this thing, like, I'm not a bad person, right? And that's not really what's in the Bible, right? We all have selfishness and sin in us. We know that. That doesn't mean that we're all horrible people, but it's a truth about us that we need to recognize and understand. So we're going to look at the book of Job. Job wrestles with this idea of why do bad things happen? And the first thing I want us to know about the book of Job is this. Most scholars believe that this was not a real guy. This is not like a historical book where they're writing down something that actually happened and recording actual words that people said. Most people look at this as a literature book. I kind of think of it like, I have a copy of like Midsummer's Night Dream, like Shakespeare plays, like on the bookshelf. Like, it's a play. If you look at it, it's a play. Like, there are big, long speeches by people. It's just like that. Like, if you've ever read a play before, that's what the book of Job is, right? And the other reason I want you to know that, because if you start reading it, you're going to see in the first couple chapters that to set up the book, to set up the reason why bad stuff happens to Job, and this is not the real answer, by the way. We'll get to that, but it starts out with God in heaven and Satan kind of walking into the throne room and saying, you know what? People only love you because you bless them. And God's like, no way, Job, he's my best guy. He'll love me no matter what. And Satan's like, let's test it. Right? I want you to understand that God does not do that. That is not a real thing that happens. God doesn't sit with Satan and make bets against if we're going to still follow him and be in love with God. Like, that's not what happens. Don't think that. I don't want you to think that, please. It's a play. The guy's setting stuff up in his writing so he can deal with the real questions that he wants to deal with, right? Get that in your head. And this book also uses the Jewish tradition of questioning to get to truth. If you ever go to a synagogue, a lot of things you'll hear, it's not just straight teaching like this is this, this is this. A lot of times they use questions to bring out answers, and then people answer back with questions, not answers. And that seems really weird and odd to some of us, but that's a Jewish tradition, and this book follows it to the T. I mean, it's just question after question after question by everyone. So be ready for a lot of questions when you read it, right? So in that, this book doesn't really give us a great answer for the problem of why bad things happen. It just doesn't. Right? There's a lot of questions, but it doesn't give us an explicit answer. But again, it's a tough book that talks about the problem of pain, right? We live in a time where reason and formulas kind of run everything, right? We're like, well, 2 + 2 is 4, the Pythagorean theorem. This is what photosynthesis is. Like, it's like cause and effect. We know the formula and things work. So in our heads, we have the formula that if I'm a good person, things should go well for me and my life will be easy and good. That's what it is, right? And if we're in church, we add another one, and we say, if I'm a good person, life should go well for me if I believe in God, and then everything will be good, right? Like, we add the believe in God thing. But everyone kind of has the same assumption in our culture that as long as we're a good person, stuff's supposed to go well for us. And this is just not the formula of life. And the book of Job tells us this. That's not the formula, guys. It's just not. We can't run our life off of that formula. And Satan comes in the beginning of Job and is betting on that formula, right? Like, he's saying, you know what? People believe this. And if you take that away from them, God, they're not going to love you, right? The real question is, Satan's saying, can people just love you, God, for you? And the answer is, most of us probably not, right? Like, we have a hard time dealing with pain and evil. So why is pain and evil so disturbing? We ask this question, and it just is, right? It's hard. We don't like being hurt. We don't like things not going the way we hoped that they would go. We don't like seeing suffering. I mean, there's nothing good about it. We all understand that. But the reason pain and evil is so disturbing is because it doesn't have a reason. It's absolutely irrational. Like, we think we have these formulas, this way set up of how life should go and what it should look like and what's fair and what's good. And evil and pain never make sense. You know, we can find cause and effect of maybe why something happened, but not for everything, right? Like when people get diseases and it's not caused by a certain action they did or a certain thing that was around them, like, why? Why? It just doesn't make sense. And the book of Job kind of reminds us of that. Sometimes pain and evil just don't make sense. There's not a cause and effect for it. It's not because God caused this thing to happen. It just is part of life because we live in a world that has sin and brokenness in it. That's it. So, can we still love God even though our formula is wrong, right? Our formula of just being a good person is wrong. C.S. Lewis states the question that's in all of our hearts whenever we go through something wrong. He says, if God were good, he would want his creations to be perfectly happy. And if he were all-powerful, he would be able to do as he wished. But his creation is not always happy. So either God is not all-powerful or he's not all good. Now, C.S. Lewis was a guy who was very smart, didn't always believe in God, but came to belief in God and understood that this is a huge problem that we all wrestle with, right? We all ask, God, why? Why does this bad stuff happen? If you love us, why? It's a fair question, and guess what? This book doesn't say that we can't ask it. In fact, it invites us to ask it and wrestle through this hard stuff with God, right? So Job is a good guy. And in the book, the first chapter, he loses everything. He loses all of his livestock, which was like money back then, right? Like he loses all of his riches, goes through different times. He has a great, wonderful family that loves and follows God. And all of his kids are together at one of the kids' house. And something happens, they all die, right? And then Job is sad, but he's not cursing God. He doesn't get mad. And then Satan goes back to God and says, you know what? Job's not cursing you because those are things. And you can kind of get over the loss of that. But take away his health, and then he'll curse you, God. And so Satan is allowed to afflict Job with these boils all over his body, right? So Job's sitting there in ashes at his house where there's nothing left. And all he has left is his wife. And his wife looks at him and says, Job, why don't you curse God and die? Thanks, honey. That's great advice, right? Like, it's so not helpful. And then Job gets these 3 friends who come and are trying to help him, and pretty much all they say to him is, Job, you sinned, you caused all this, just repent and tell God you're sorry. And Job the whole time saying, I didn't do anything to deserve this, right? Remember, evil's irrational, and Job's saying, guys, evil's irrational. I didn't do anything to cause this. It's not my fault, right? And we're always looking for someone to blame, and they're like, well, obviously, Job, it's you. But so don't be those friends when something goes wrong in someone's life. I'm like, man, that's your fault. You just need to get over it. That doesn't help people move on too often, unless it really is their fault and they did something really dumb. And you kind of sometimes that happens, right? But Job doesn't blame God openly, but he starts to wrestle with why all the way through the book. And then he starts to question where God is. He's like, God, where are you? Do you even care about me? And we say that too. And Job even kind of likens it to a cat playing with a mouse. He's like, God, that's what I feel like is going on right now. Like, why don't you just either kill me or quit messing with me, kind of thing. And then read Job chapter 38. I'm not going to read it here, but it's amazing. God comes back and just answers Job in question form. He's like, where were you when the earth was made? Did you lay its foundations? Like, what do you know? Kind of is what God lays down to Job. And then in 39, God says this really weird thing, but I think it's super important. He says, do you know how long it takes for a deer to be pregnant? And are you there with it when it gives birth in pain all alone? God here is saying, I'm with anything that I choose to be. And I choose to be with you. I choose to be with this deer and care about it in its time of pain and agony and giving birth. He says, if I'm doing that for a deer, how much more am I going to do it for you, who I love and made in my image? Right? God is saying, I'm there beside you, even when bad stuff happens. So what's the takeaway here? Are we supposed to just deal with things? Or are we supposed to think that God causes all this stuff to happen? Are we supposed to just sit there in self-pity and say, life sucks and it's not my fault? No, this is not very helpful. But the book doesn't really give us a good answer. At the end, Job says, you know what, God, I'm sorry I said all those things about you and questioned you. You're too amazing for me to understand. I'm sorry. Thank you. You're God. I take back everything I said. So it doesn't give us an answer as to why bad things happen. It just doesn't. But I think the book of Job asks this question and does answer it. Where do you go with your agony? Right? Where do you go when bad stuff happens? Do you go and look for other gods or idols to make sense of it? Do you leave God alone, the God that you know, because this isn't going the way you hoped it would go, and you try and find something else that will tell you that it's all going to be okay, or you're going to put your hope in some other God just because you didn't think that this God lived up to the deal that you thought you had with it, right? Like, no, God really is God, and he's there with us, but he doesn't change the natural order of things just to make everything go well for us. He never promised that, and there are reasons why that goes on, right? But we know we have hope in heaven, and we know that those things will change, and that's amazing truth to know. But as for here on this earth, bad stuff's going to happen, and it just changes how we deal with it being in a relationship with him, right? So where do we go in our agony? Do we go run away from God and find other gods or idols to follow to make us feel safe? Or do we just post on Facebook or Instagram or Twitter about how unjust God is, right? No. The book answers where you go with your agony is you go to God. God says he's there and he cares about you. He's not leaving you alone. Go to God whenever you deal with the rough stuff, whenever evil happens, and he is mourning with you. He will give you strength and he will help you. Now, does this help us feel better about how bad stuff is sometimes? Maybe not. It's a rough book. Don't read this if you're going through something horrible. It doesn't really make you feel better. But this is wisdom literature. It teaches us truth. Bad stuff's going to happen because we live in a broken, sin-filled world, right? And it's not God causing it. And it's not that he doesn't love us, that he doesn't stop it. It's just that a reminder that he is there with us in it. Love you guys. Have an amazing week.